All right. So I'm going to be recording this as we go along, and then I'll be posting this up on Canvas for others to watch. So today we're going to be talking about cultural regions of Native North America. And before we get going too far, I just want to clarify a couple of things. I've seen a lot of people have participated in the discussions, and those of you, I haven't checked everyone's yet. So make sure you're participating in the discussions and posting some information. You're allowed to go ahead and post things before the due dates, but really pay attention to those due dates online. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about regions, cultural regions of Native North America. So yesterday in our discussion, we talked about the very ancient Paleolithic peoples and the different cultural groups that arrived from Asia and migrated into North and South America. Now today we're going to be talking about something different. So in those groups we talk about cultural groups, but not necessarily cultures as much as just groups of people in general. So today what we're going to be talking about are civilizations. So one of the things that is important for us to note here, I lost my slides here. One of the things that's important to note is that we're talking about civilizations. So can anyone want to chime in and see if they can have an answer to this question? So the question is, what is a civilization? What are some civilizations that existed in the Americas before the arrival of modern Europeans? So can anyone think they list any civilizations? Okay, Marcia says the Aztecs. Okay. Anyone else have anything? So we have Dana and Ashton participating as well, until some others probably join in. So what do we have? We have the Aztecs. Can you guys think of any other groups of civilizations that may have existed in the Americas prior to the arrival of the Europeans? The Maya. Okay, very good. Excellent. Two of which we're going to talk about today. And those are, when we talk about those groups, we're referring to Mesoamerican civilizations. But one of the things that we're going to be talking about today are some North American civilizations, the civilizations that existed in the North, in North America, in the eastern United States, and the southwest part of the United States, that we tend to not really talk about very often. Your textbook talks about them. We will talk about the Aztecs, and we'll talk about the Maya, but we are going to be talking about some other groups of people as well, some other civilizations that existed prior to what we think of today as modern day Native Americans. Okay, so here we have just like a little bit of breakdown of what's happening in this part of the world, just to kind of get some ideas here. In terms of religion, these peoples that we're going to be talking about in terms of religion, there's no sharp distinction between the natural and the supernatural worlds. And this may sound familiar when we talk about Native American religions. There tends to be this connection with nature. Okay? And these religions, these cultures we're talking about, this has existed throughout the Americas. In terms of land and property, land was not a commodity, and it was used communally, and trade was based on gift giving. So what I mean by a commodity is something that can be bought and sold. In this case, it was owned by everyone. In fact, the idea of ownership didn't really exist in a lot of these native groups and a lot of these early civilizations until they started to produce more larger civilizations like the Maya and the Aztec. But land was used communally, meaning people farmed on it, they took turns raising crops, and they worked together as a group. In terms of gender relations, most societies were matrilineal. Today, most of our societies are patrilineal. We have a patriarchal society where our lineage is determined by our fathers. We have our fathers' last names, and that's usually the way. I know some cultures tend to use a little bit of both. But in this case, the gender relations among the Native Americans were mostly matrilineal. The women decided who would be the rulers, for example, and then the men would often rule. There was often premarital sex, but also serial monogamy as well. So people took a while before they would sit down, and maybe they married lots of different people, and one at a time, obviously, but they could have lots of different husbands and wives and switch between the two. Women were powerful and participated in the selection of the male heirs, like I mentioned. Plants and animals were considered spiritual beings, and there was this idea of reciprocity, that whatever you give, you get in return, and vice versa. So if you take something from nature, you return it to nature. This idea of working back and forth with one another. Now, just to kind of get an idea of some of these groups that we're talking about, here's some maps showing the different regional groups and different areas we're talking about. So today we're going to be talking about, let me go to my slides here. Today we're going to be talking about these people in this part of the world here, the Mesoamerican region, and also down here in the Inca region as well. But we're going to be talking also about these desert hunter-gatherers, different groups, especially here if you look at this map in this part of the world. And we're also going to be looking at eastern regions as well. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So here we go. Let's take a look at some of these groups. So prior to that, one of the things we should talk about is where they got their food. Now, we're often shown these images of the buffalo hunt and the great buffalo hunts of the Native Americans. Now, of course, things were a lot different prior to the Europeans' arrival. In fact, I kind of show this idea here that they didn't hunt them like this in the bottom on horses. That wasn't until after the Europeans arrived. They would often chase them off the edge of cliffs and then gather the ones that have broken their necks or died in the fall. They would just that's how they would move stuff. There is a horse still up here, but they would run on foot and chase them off. Now, the primary source of protein in west of the Mississippi was the bison, and there were buffalo in northern parts of New York as well, but eventually were hunted to near extinction. And in the east of the Mississippi, mostly caribou was hunted. So this is who we're looking at when we're thinking about the different types of food that these peoples are eating during this time period. It's just in terms of protein. All right, so let's take a little tour of some of the groups that are in the Americas prior to the Europeans' arrivals. The first group that we're going to be talking about are the Maya. Now, these are some pictures that I took on a trip that I recently went on last year to Mexico. Now, the Maya civilization lasted from about 2000 BCE to 900 CE, okay? And then it flourished again from about 950 until the fall of the Maya completely by the Spaniards in 1539. Okay, so they were a large civilization, the classical civilization we often refer to, from 2000 to 900, and then kind of lived in that area from 950 to 1539. They were an intensive farming society. They built terraces and canals, and they even farmed shrimp. Astronomy was very important and very popular in Mayan society, as well as hygiene, good nutrition, and fitness for rulers who often lived up to 90 years of age. And yesterday when we looked at some of the video from last time, the lecture last time, we talked about these ancient Kennewick men who lived to, maybe 55 years old. So now we're living in groups, and these people are living longer, especially rulers at 90 years of age or older. So it's really a large life expectancy. For most of the commoners, they usually lived to about 40 or 50 years of age, which is still pretty old. Around 600 to 800 CE, one of the largest cities in the Maya, known as Tikal, Tikal, had about 50,000 inhabitants, a very large city for 600 to 800 CE. Even some of the large cities in the pre-modern world in Europe and Asia weren't this large. So we're growing here. Now, a couple images that I have here. This is the El Castillo, the famous temple of Kukulkan, or Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. And if you look here, here's the image of the feathered serpent at the bottom. And like I said, they were very big on astronomy. And one of the most amazing things about this temple that was later uncovered in the 19th century, or in the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, was that after careful reconstruction of this and looking at it, and looking at the old charts and some of the old codices left behind by the Maya, we made a lot of rather interesting discoveries. And we discovered that what we're looking at is not just a temple, but a calendar. This is a mixture of both a lunar, a solar calendar, and the Mayan long count calendar. So each piece of this temple represents something. So for example, there are these steps on the side: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Times 2 is 18. Times 4, if I can do my math right, is 52. No, 60 is 62, which is the number of the lunar months that they're talking about. The 9 sides here, 18 sides on both sides are how many months there are in the calendar. There's 18 months in the Mayan calendar, which are located right here. The sides of the steps, there's 365 steps total for the number of days in the year. And then the different platforms represent different times as well, and then 52 little steps going up the sides as well. So lots of calendar representation in here. The calendar is also, the temple is also organized so during the autumnal and spring equinoxes, shadows are cast down the side of this image here. So if you visit this time during the spring equinox, as the sun moves across the sky, these marks that you see here on the side here, the shadows extend, and it forms kind of a little, if you look at this side here, this side like this forms a little, looks like a snake's back going down, and it appears like a snake is crawling down and coming out, which means that Kukulkan is coming in from the skies and moving down into the earth to fertilize everything. So very interesting culture. Now, of course, it was mostly centered in what we call Mesoamerica, the Yucatan Peninsula, and this was one of the early civilizations that existed in here. Now, as we move further along down in terms of civilizations, the next group that we arrive at are the Aztecs, which are centered more in the kind of near Oaxaca Valley and the Mexico Valley in the middle of the Central America here. So around the 800s, a group of Nahuatl speakers left northern Mexico and traveled down into the Valley of Mexico. And they were kind of traveling all over in this area. In the 1100 CE, the Aztecs finally arrived in this region. Now, if you look at this map that I posted here, there are lots of different groups, okay? Now, Aztec is the name that the Spaniards gave these peoples, but in reality, there were other groups as well. But the main group we usually call the Mexica, and there were also a lot of members of this triple alliance of powerful tribes here. Okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about. We're talking about this region right here in modern-day Mexico. Now, around 1428, an alliance was made between some different groups, and they decided to unite against the other groups and demand tribute from regional groups. And this tribute allowed the the Aztec Empire to grow in very large numbers. Now, we often think, when we think of the Aztecs, does anyone want to share what they think, when they think Aztecs, what's the first thing that pops into our minds when we think of the Aztecs? We want to share any things that we could think of? What's the first thing, when we think of Aztec peoples, what do we usually think of? What are some things that pop into our brains when we're thinking of these peoples? I'll give you a couple of seconds to respond before I go on here. When you have any ideas, here we go. Advanced farming techniques, okay? Especially, I'm not sure, I can't see this image very well here. There were farming techniques. Do you know in particular what type of farming techniques were used by the Maya? Anyone have any ideas? Or, excuse me, by the Aztec? Well, if not, we can talk a little bit about some of the things that we typically think of. So one of the things that we typically think of with the Aztec, especially if you saw the film Apocalypto a couple years back, they're very big on human sacrifice. This is one of the things that we typically think about when we think of the Aztecs. This idea of large numbers of human sacrifice, parades of people that went on for days while they were removing their heads to appease their gods. And one of the things we don't usually talk about is the educational system and the other ways society has been set up. So the Aztec civilization, aside from its rulers and its patriarchal system and what's happening here, also set up several different schools. And it's important that I mention this because when the Europeans arrived, they often thought that these were just people that had no idea what they were doing. They thought they weren't educated. They were illiterate groups of people. But in reality, there were educational regions set up here. So there were two schools that were set up in the Aztec civilization. The Telpochcali, which is spelled Telpochcali, Telpochcali, which was a school for commoners. They learned history and religion, military arts, and a trade or craft. So they learned how to farm and how to make different things. And this was open to all males, and some females attended. So we had, in a way, kind of universal education. We also have what was known as the Calmecac, C-A-L-M-E-C-A-C, Calmecac, which was a school for the nobility. So two schools, one for the commoners, one for the nobility. The Kalmatak trained leaders like priests and scholars and teachers, healers and codex painters. They studied rituals, ancient and contemporary history, literature, geometry, poetry, and the military arts. And again, open to all males, and some females attended as well. So kind of like a universal education system set up in the the Aztec civilization, one that existed maybe 100 or 200 years longer than what had existed in Europe in the university system. So a lot more advanced than we often think. Now we're going to move south. So we've talked about the Maya, we've talked about the Aztec. The other great civilization that the Europeans came in contact with were the Inca. Okay, the Inca civilization flourished from about 1438 to 1533, famous for their terrace farming, mostly famous for this image here of Machu Picchu, this great citadel in the clouds. And the difference here was that this was an empire with an emperor, centralized power and government that controlled things and organized road building and even the labor force as well. So we're unlike the Aztecs, where it was mostly a religious ceremonies led by the leaders. The emperor known as the Inca, the term Inca means emperor, led the government and organized government over a huge swath of land. So whereas the Aztec Empire, the Aztec civilization may have only covered a landmass like maybe 800 miles by 800 miles, the Inca civilization spanned a coastline of nearly 4,000 miles. Very large area of land governed by a group of people. A couple images here. This is me and my husband in Machu Picchu. We went last year and kind of hiked all over the place. And this image down in the bottom right here, does anyone want to guess what this is? Anyone want to guess what we have down here in the bottom right? What do we have here? Anyone? Any suggestions? If you were traveling around and you came across this thing down here in the bottom, what do you think this might be? Any suggestions? Any guesses? No guesses? We're all tuned out. Aha. Nazca. Okay, so Dana, I think you're referring to, oops, I went too far here. The Nazca lines, is that what you're referring to, those giant lines? And that's just northwest of or southwest of here. Okay, so those are giant lines drawn in for who knows what, showing different images. If you don't know what that is, you guys should look that up. It's really cool. But what this is actually is, so we call this terrace farming. So the region that the Inca lived in was very steep. If you ever travel to the Andes, it's a very steep region. And what they would do is they would build these terraces, and they would basically carve into the side of the mountains and have this land. So if you look at this image of Machu Picchu here, way up here on the top where my little cursor is, up there are terraces. You can actually, if you're there, you can see them kind of carved into the mountainside. And they would do farming there, basically using every bit of land that they could. So what this is this is a terrace farm. This is the lowest level, and it keeps going up, up, up. And what this was a laboratory, a place in the Andes where they would grow things like potatoes and different types of corns and different types of seeds that they would use, that they would disperse everywhere else. Now, this farm is located at about 14 or 15,000 feet above sea level. Very, very, very high. In fact, the most of Peru, especially after you leave the coastal regions, is very, very high. It's one of the highest mountains in both Peru and Bolivia. But this is where they did their farming. So all the scientists, the farmers would go here, they'd learn how to grow things at high altitudes, and then once they got a good rootstock, they would distribute it to the rest of their civilization, the rest of their culture. So once again, a very advanced civilization with lots of building and lots of really amazing things. And in fact, all the buildings are held together only by stone. There's no mortar, there's nothing holding the ancient buildings together. And in fact, when earthquakes would hit, which there's lots of earthquakes in the Andes, Spanish buildings would collapse where the ancient Inca buildings would still survive. And just to clarify, Inca, like I said, refers to the leader, and the people we usually refer to as Quechua, 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 which is a language spoken by the natives. In fact, it's still spoken by about 30% of the population in Peru today is they're Quechua speakers. So it's a language that they speak. All right, are there any questions so far about these civilizations in Mesoamerica and South America? Now, these are the big three that we typically talk about, the ones that you guys mentioned earlier as well, that we have the Inca, the Maya, and the Aztec. And there are other groups as well, but these are kind of the big three that Europeans come in contact with when they finally arrive, which we'll talk about tomorrow when we talk about European exploration. All right, so now let's turn our focus back up north. So we're in Mesoamerica, down to the South America, and now we're going to head up to North America. Now, these are the civilizations that were around prior to the arrival of Europeans. And the only difference was a lot of these groups disappeared around a couple hundred years prior to the arrival of the Europeans. Now, around 4,000 years ago, tribal groups in North America acquired corn and squash and beans from Mexico. They learned how to irrigate. Men joined women as farmers. And about 3,500 years ago, there was widespread evidence of duck decoys in the Southwest. Now, why on earth is this important? Well, when we think of the American Southwest, and if anyone's traveled to Arizona or New Mexico or Texas or even southern Nevada, it doesn't seem like a region where there would be lots of ducks flying around or lots of irrigation and lots of lakes and rivers. But during this time, from about 500 to 700 to 800, there was a lot of rain and there was a lot of water. And we know this because there were decoys, duck decoys. And when there's duck decoys, that means they were hunting ducks or fishing fishing in different areas as well. So we know that at the time that these civilizations, Hohokam and the Anasazi and these groups, we know at the time when they arrived, when they were there was lots of water. Now, the first civilization that I'm going to talk about is what's known as the Hohokam civilization. They arrived around 500 CE in southwest Arizona. They dug irrigation canals as long as 10 miles long, and they would often have two successive crops of corn, beans, and squash. Now, extensive trade existed between both northern Mexico and the Hohokam civilization. The largest group that the largest city that we often talk about is a place called Casa Grande near today's Coolidge, Arizona. And if we look at the image down here, we can see we have these big buildings, and this is kind of an artistic rendition of what this civilization could have created during this time period. Now, there was also, we think that they were the ancestors of both the Mogollon and the Anasazi, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then from about 1276 to 1293, there was a cycle of drought, which caused this civilization to disperse. So one of the important things about these ancient civilizations in the Americas, and this included not just North America, but those in South America and Mesoamerica, civilization rose and fall oftentimes because of the environment, and also on how terribly they treated their environment. So if they overwatered or over-irrigated an area and didn't store enough water and a drought hits, the people just don't all die. They often disperse, and they go other places. In fact, today when you go to modern-day Mexico and the Yucatan, and even Quintana Roo on the east side of Mexico on the peninsula, you still run into Maya and Mayan peoples. So the Mayans didn't disappear. They weren't all killed off and died when the Europeans arrived. They just dispersed and left their cities behind. So what we see are left behind cities. So these people went somewhere else, and what we're left with are cities. Now, around 700 CE, there was an increase in summer rainfall, which we call monsoons, and a new group of people known as the Anasazi appeared in North America. Didn't appear, kind of just organized civilization. They're known for building multi-storied adobe homes, and there's the Cliff Palace, which is down here in orange here, that it was located, that kind of took over, that they built these areas right under the cliffs here. And they also were faced with large drought, a cycle of drought at the same time as the Hohokam civilization, and they dispersed as well. Now, the cycle of drought caused a crisis among the Anasazi and Hohokam, and they dispersed. Now, the societies that eventually developed in this area, we refer to them as the descendants of these ancient peoples. In fact, Anasazi just means ancient peoples. And this included the Pueblo, the Hopi, the Acoma, and the Zuni, located in this part of southwest United States. According to the belief systems, everything had a spirit: wind, fire, rocks, rivers, trees, animals, etc. Everyone had a spirit. The Apache and the Navajo developed from these descendants as well, great hunters and traders. And the Navajo adopted Pueblo farming and traded with Mississippian societies, which we'll talk about next. So if you look at the image, this is what we're talking about. These are the regions that we're talking about. So this is where the Anasazi were located in present day, around the Four Corners region. The Hohokam, closer to mostly in Arizona, and the Mogollon, which we didn't talk about, but may have been descendants as well in the New Mexico and New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Mexico and Arizona. So these are these regions that we're talking about. So these large civilizations so far existed in the eastern side, the western side, southwest of the United States, which of course, like I mentioned, today is desert, but at that time may have been a lot greener and a lot more able to sustain life. Now I'm going to skip this slide, and we're going to look instead, look instead at Eastern civilizations. So we talked about the Western civilizations, now we're going to look at the Eastern civilizations. So from about 1500 BCE, settlement along the Mississippi floodplain started to grow. Eastern women started to cultivate gourds and squash and pumpkins and sunflowers and other vegetables. And we also have evidence of ceramics, carving of stone grinders, and gourds, which are used, the gourds especially and the ceramics are used to store things. And we may think that this is not a very important aspect of this discussion, but when you have gourds and ceramics to store things, it usually means you have lots of stuff. And when you start to develop a surplus, that means you can feed more people and the population grows. Now, from about 600 to 1000 CE, northern flint or maize, corn, started to be dispersed in this area and grown in the area as well. The diet initially consisted of mostly maize and squash, and later beans. So our three sisters, as we often refer to them, as corn, squash, and beans. Now, the two civilizations that we're going to talk about that developed in this part of the world are both what's known as the Adena Hopewell civilization and Cahokia. Now, the Adena Hopewell civilization traded between the Gulf Coast, Lake Superior, and the Rocky Mountains. We found evidence of art, including jewelry and smoking pipes and musical panpipes, and even precious metals like copper and stones like quartz, and even shark and grizzly bear teeth, and even silver in this region. Now, these are important to note because when you start to develop jewelry and ceramics and pots, that also means the civilization is developing an artisan class. So a group of people that develop stuff, not necessarily for use, no utilitarian purpose, just to be able to have the free time to do so. The second civilization that develops during this time period, around the 7th century, along the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, was Cahokia. Now, Cahokia, around the 13th century, probably had as many as 20 to 30,000 people. The settlement was surrounded by dozens of farming villages, and they had commerce with the Midwest and the Southwest. And they even built fortified walls around their cities. And if you look at the images in here in the bottom right-hand corner, we have an artistic representation of these large earthenware kind of pyramids that were built. And on the top of this was a ritualistic platform where they would maybe perform rituals for more rain or a better cycle of farming. Now, once again, the same time as in the Southwest, a cycle of drought from 1276 to 1294 caused a population dispersal. And these civilizations disappear. The people don't, but the civilization disappears. So all this happens by 1293, and these large groups disappear. Now, one other thing that I want to show you here is this image. Okay, so this is the Great Serpent Mound located in the Mississippi River region of the United States. Now, including all three parts, the Serpent Mound extends about 1,370 feet. So that's close to a mile long. No, excuse me, about a quarter of a mile long. And varies in height from less than a foot to more than 3 feet. Now, conforming to the curves of the land on which it rests, with its head approaching a cliff above a stream, the serpent winds back and forth for more than 800 feet and 7 coils, and ends in a triple coiled tail. And you can see the tail at the end there. Now, the serpent head has an open mouth extending around the east end of a 120-foot long hollow oval feature that may represent the snake eating an egg, though some scholars posit that the oval feature symbolizes the sun and the body of a frog, or merely the remnant of a platform. Now, the effigy's extreme western feature is a triangular mound approximately 30 feet at its base and a long axis. And this is also oriented on an east-west orientation. So as the sun comes up, it appears like it comes up out of its tail and sets into its mouth. So it's kind of the same idea of what's happening in Mesoamerica with the Maya and the building of their temples. So that's kind of an interesting image right there. All right, the last slide of today kind of shows some of these extensive trade networks of the different area. And you can see people just didn't stick around in one little area. They traded all over the place. So people were trading with people as far as the Northwest down to Florida, following these great trade routes. Now, a lot of these routes were eventually used by Europeans when they arrived, and a lot of these routes eventually developed into what we have today, our interstate freeway system. So we often would borrow these old trails, and these trails were developed by following animals around particularly. So here's our image showing the different things here. Now, before we conclude today's discussion, does anybody have any questions regarding today's lecture, or even things that are coming up by the next week? Anyone have any questions? Let's see. Nope, Marcia has no questions. Okay, a couple things to show you here in our syllabus, just to kind of clarify. We're in week 2 right now, so if everyone can see this, we finished conference 1, conference 2. By tonight, you need to have your primary source typed, your primary response typed up, and your week 2 discussion post completed, and then the discussion post in question from today's, and a practice quiz for chapter 1 by tomorrow. So I tried to move the dates around so you can get going right here. Now, before I have you leave, I wanted to show you a couple of things. So how many of you are using the Canvas app? Are any of the 4 in the room here using the Canvas app? Okay, so we have Ashton's using it. Let's see here. Oops, scroll down here. Dana's not using it. Marcia's not using it. Okay, so I wanted to quickly show you what this app looks like for those of you who haven't. So I'm going to really quickly connect here to my phone. Okay, give me 1 second here. Let's see here. Oops, airplane. There we go. Okay, there it is. Okay, so hopefully you can see on my screen in front of me here. This is the app that we can use in this class here. Where'd you guys go? There you go. So this is the app that we can use in the class. So if you click on the American history to 1877 in our class here, you can see all the things that it's available here up on the screen. You can visit the home, syllabus, announcements, all this different stuff here. You can continue, you can do your quizzes online. You can, not the conferences, and Confer now is a little bit different. You can actually do it at home on your phone or outside of your house as well. You don't have to be at a computer as long as you have good Wi-Fi. And I can later show you how to do that. But if you click on the modules section, it shows you all the stuff that we have. So in week 2, these are all the things that are due. And some of the stuff you can actually do and submit online, as well as some of the videos you can watch, as well as all the calendar. Now, what's also really cool is the calendar that it shows in the bottom here, which shows you when things are due. So today is the 17th, tomorrow the 18th, and it's actually, there you go, that's moved there, it's adjusted. So the 17th, something is due, 18th is something to do, and if you click on that image there, it shows you different, what's due that day and what you need to turn in. it's kind of a really neat way to use the information here. So that's that. So I just wanted to share that with you guys before I let you guys go. So I appreciate you guys joining in and participating. Does anyone have any comments they want to make about today's? Do you guys prefer this to anything else that we've done so far? Do you prefer this over the actual conference option, or does it not really matter to you guys? What do you guys think? So Marcia prefers it. It's actually a little easier system to get used to. And as we move further along, if you feel brave enough to show your picture and show your face and ask questions, you could actually, if it's a quiet enough room, we can actually all participate and talk to each other as well. It's a great way to have the discussion. So that is all that I have for us today. I appreciate you guys jumping in. Hopefully you guys can leave some comments and on discussion forums and get more people involved, to get people to come in here. And I look forward to seeing some of you guys tomorrow. It looks like on our calendar here, let me just take a look here. We have another conference, another discussion tomorrow on Age of Exploration, and then a break, and then one last on colonial societies. So hopefully you guys can chime in and participate, and I will see you guys tomorrow. So everyone have a wonderful night, and thank you for participating.